Nuclear crises. So the critical question here is, do nuclear weapons cause war or peace? Here we have Indian artillery firing at the Northern Light Infantry of the Pakistan Army in Kargil in 1999. This artillery exchange and the fighting was occurring while both states possessed nuclear weapons. So we have a case of the Sino-Soviet border war. China and the Soviet Union, both communist, formerly the closest of allies, drifted apart ideologically after the Soviet Union refused to use nuclear weapons to provoke a war with the West, or specifically to back China in its 1958 confrontation during the Taiwan Straits crisis with the US Navy. China test detonated its first nuclear weapon in 1964, and it was in that year that China began provoking border clashes with the Soviet Union on their common Siberian border, which the Chinese claimed total was 4,189 incidents. By 1969, the Chinese Cultural Revolution was approaching its apex, and it was more than likely that it was this that led the bold Chinese action against the Soviet-patrolled border. You can see on the top Soviet troops, and on the bottom a Badger bomber of the Soviet Air Force. Here is a Russian and Chinese patrol confronting each other. On March 2nd, 1969, a platoon to company-sized Soviet force crossing the Ussuri River was ambushed and destroyed by a force of Chinese People's Liberation Army units on the disputed Hai-Tsiatsu Island opposite the Soviet city of Khabarovsk on the confluence of the Amur and Ussuri River in Siberia. The island was in dispute since the 1858 Treaty of Aigun, in which the island was awarded to the Russians. The Soviets and the Chinese quickly deployed additional units to the area, with combat of up to regimental size. The clashes spread to the Xinjiang border, which was on the opposite side of China. The fighting was to last to March 15th and was probably concluded by Soviet dominance, particularly in its deployed artillery. China is thought to have lost a brigade of soldiers fighting the Soviets in Xinjiang province on August 13, 1969. On August 28th, China ordered mobilization in provinces around the Soviet Union and Mongolia. What made the event critical was the fact that both China and the Soviet Union at the time were in possession of nuclear weapons, although the Soviet Union had a far more sophisticated and numerous arsenal. Here you can see People's Liberation Army soldiers of China overlooking the Ussuri River near Khabarovsk. This is the city of Khabarovsk, and this is the general area where the island was in dispute. You can see that here. This is very vulnerable because the Soviet rail network basically comes around like this, right on the border. And it's a relatively narrow and vulnerable. Although the clash did not constitute a war, probably because less than 1,000 soldiers were killed, it was a large-scale military engagement between frontline military forces. While this may not have undermined the theoretical claim that nuclear deterrence is robust, it does indicate that nuclear weapons do not deter all forms of lethal conflict. As researchers, we're left with crucial questions of determining just how much nuclear weapons deter. Do they stop territorial invasion, occupation of the capital, the use of nuclear weapons themselves in conflict? Here you can see Soviet tanks in deployment. In August of 1969, the Soviets leaked their interest to the US of hitting China with a counterforce attack. This would mean attacking and targeting Chinese nuclear forces. The US did not respond. Here in the picture you can see a DF-31 missile on a launch pad. This is the standard ICBM, solid fuel that would be fired at North America. And you can see a PLA YJ-63 land attack cruise missile that would be launched from an aircraft. So this could also be used to attack ships. The aircraft behind it is a Soviet Badger bomber, which the Chinese term an H-6. This is the Kuropatkin line. Kuropatkin was a Russian general from the 19th century. It was a line that captures about 70% of China's population and economy. And the Soviets found it to be within reach of their forces since the 19th century up until the end of the Cold War. So it was a theoretical area that China would have to defend, and it was the theoretical area that the Soviets would use tactical nuclear weapons in advance to conquer rapidly. Now this brings us to a review of the stability-instability paradox that we spoke about earlier. Kenneth Boulding argued that if deterrence were really stable, meaning it would stop war, it would cease to deter. If by stability we meant that nuclear weapons would operate with certainty against opposing nuclear weapons, but not against conventional forces, would this encourage or discourage conflict? Glenn Snyder argued that if nuclear weapons are viewed as unusable, then they will encourage conflict using conventional weapons. Now, while nuclear weapons may deter threats to the core values of the state, such as the occupation of the capital, and the use of the enemy's nuclear weapons against the state, they deter nothing else. This perfect strategic stability thereby encourages instability at the conventional level, where it is far less likely that deterrence will prevail as robustly. Now our second case, 1999 Dras-Kargil dispute. In late May 1999, about a battalion-sized unit of infiltrators and most 500 soldiers, probably made up both of Kashmiris and non-Kashmiri sympathizers, infiltrated into Indian-occupied Kashmir from Pakistan. What their precise goal was is a mystery. It appears likely that they were seeking to infiltrate more deeply into Kashmir, but that they were halted near the Dras-Kargil and ultimately occupied the peaks of those mountains. The unit dug itself into a defensive position on the Indian side, and the Indian army, discovering them, then conducted a number of unsuccessful and costly attacks. Kargil was a strategic point because through it ran the only year-round highway to Leh, which was the part of Kashmir that China failed to capture from India in 1962. So here's the map of India-Pakistan. You can see Kashmir in the north, indicated by the dashed lines. You can see here Kargil more specifically. Kargil is right here. And it's in this area, Dras-Kargil, where the road is closest to the Pakistan border and the peaks of the mountains there. This is the Kargil sector, where the infiltration occurred along National Highway 1A. Here you can see the area of intrusions, somewhat to the east. This is the Dras area to the west, showing the area of intrusion just across the border. And this is the Siachen Glacier section, which is an area in dispute between India and Pakistan, and where the soldiers fire artillery at each other routinely. It's so high altitude that the artillery tables, which control the trajectory of the shells, had to be rewritten. I've met Pakistani soldiers from there who basically suffered permanent brain damage. They're at such an altitude, they suffer from oxygen deprivation. In fact, it takes them months to get up there because you have to go up each layer of the mountain and stay a week to get acclimatized. At that altitude, a great many soldiers suffer from pulmonary edema, which is sort of a collection of blood clots having to do with the way that respiration interacts with very low levels of oxygen. It's absolute hell. But the Pakistanis don't want the Indians to advance because it could cut off and threaten the Karakoram Highway with China. So it's strategic territory. So the Dras-Kargil dispute has some background. In August 1965, infiltrators from Pakistan went into Kashmir unsuccessfully under the military government of Ayub Khan. The operation was organized by General Malik without the full support of the rest of the military. He basically went around the enemy's chain of command. Civilian elements that were adventurous encouraged him to conduct the operation, but ultimately it was a very poorly planned operation because it wasn't done with other ministries of the state. So when the operation did occur, it was a bit of a disaster. So there was a rerun of the same operation under the civilian government of Nawaz Sharif. This is a heterogeneous coalition of civilian leaders that were seeking political capital with the population with the insurgency in Kashmir, but the military and the intelligence personnel appear to have gone ahead and conducted their own operation without consulting the civilian government. There's evidence from Sharif's trial that the Military Intelligence Service, the ISI, was interested in expanding its operations into Kashmir, and that Sharif himself, as Prime Minister, was supportive of the operation to placate his Muslim League party and the more religious fundamentalist Jamiat Islamiyah party, which were pushing for action in Kashmir. It's unlikely that a pure military operation with all of the ministries involved would have been allowed. They would have seen the limitation of this operation because Pakistan did it without alerting any of its allies like China. And ultimately, India was basically encouraged by the U.S. to use military force to eject the Northern Light Infantry infiltrators in Kargil. And that's ultimately how the operation ended. India recaptured the bits of real estate that had been lost to the infiltrators. Now, Robert Jervis, a very well-known professor of political psychology and strategy at Columbia University, disagreed with the stability-instability paradox. So here's a big question. How have nuclear weapons changed world politics? And a second question, are nuclear weapons useful? So there's a quote from his article and his book, "No one can win an all-out nuclear war," close quote, which is fairly obvious. Why? Because of mutual kill capability. So in the past, states did not have to believe that they could win in order to rationally decide to fight. So you could fight and then see how it would turn out, or try to fight and then try to win allies. Number two, states also started fights that they did not know how they would end. Today, you can't do that because of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons can help you capture territory, but they can't defend against other nuclear weapons. So to answer the first question, today the fear is not losing the war, but of the war breaking out in the first place. So think of a zero-sum game. In old wars, you would divide up the pie. Their loss would be my gain, my loss would be their gain. But with nuclear weapons, you have a negative-sum game. In other words, you could end up blowing up the entire pie. Massive losses would occur to both sides. And, there are some who talk about, well, we've blown up the pie, but now let's keep competing. Let's see who can compete in terms of recovering from a nuclear war. But the problem is you always have third parties that would then take advantage of those two parties. One of the reasons that Islam erupted out of the Arabian Peninsula and was so successful is because the Persian Empire and the Byzantines had fought each other for 100 years to the point of mutual destruction by destroying all the communities and crops that lay between them. So a second question, a consideration. Who says nuclear weapons are not useful? Right? The answer is nuclear weapons are useful because they can achieve political, but not military goals. So they can achieve security. They can produce stability. Now they can produce stability because you always have a status quo advantage, meaning those who want to keep things the way they are and not change. One, the interest is greater for the status quo state. And two, the challenger state, the one that wants to change things, the one that wants to occupy territory with nuclear weapons, they have to start the war. Now the problem, of course, could occur that both sides see themselves as defending the status quo. One holding on to what it has, and the other one trying to return to a previous recent status quo. In effect, for Jervis, there is no stability-instability paradox because states do not fear nuclear weapons themselves. But they fear that any action they take may escalate into a conflict over which they lose control. It is the perpetual threat of possible escalation that ensures strategic stability, even where there's a prevailing belief that nuclear weapons are unusable. So, although nuclear weapons have reduced the likelihood of war, they have not eliminated it, and there are a number of circumstances in which states went to war while one or both of the adversaries were in possession of nuclear weapons, or in which the use of nuclear weapons were used to coerce adversaries. This is a map of Germany's plan to rewrite the borders of Europe if the Nazis had won World War II. So a simple question is, if the Nazis had nuclear weapons, would they have used them? Would they have used them in World War II, and would they have used them subsequently for further expansion, or would they have become a status quo state and used nuclear weapons as deterrence to maintain their newly created society? These are the total number of nuclear weapons and manned bombers right after the Second World War up until the late 1950s. And you can see the U.S. had a significant advantage of nuclear weapons right up until 1949. Certainly enough that they could have destroyed all the cities in Russia. Yes, the U.S. didn't move first. Here you can see the total number of warheads in the U.S. inventory going from 1945 to 1960. That's a very brief period of 15 years. That's 20,000 nuclear warheads added in a decade and a half. Here we have the next range of weapons. You can see the strategic missiles, really from the late 50s, exploding by the end of the 1970s, from 0 to 1,700. And you can see the independently targeted reentry vehicles going from 1960 to 1980, just increasing by multiples. So our first case. These are cases of nuclear coercion. Many of them come from Richard Betts, a professor at Columbia University. So these are cases of nuclear coercion. In 1946, we have the Iran dispute. The Soviet Union had occupied Iran along with the British during the Second World War to bring supplies so that the Soviet Union could fight the Nazis. At the end of the war, the Soviets didn't withdraw because they had an Azeri socialist republic, and much of northwest Iran was Azeri. So the Russians left soldiers in Iran, and some of them were supporting Azeris who wanted to secede or who wanted to influence the government in Iran. Now this caused some problem for the Iranians, and so Truman, wanting to shore up Iran's sovereignty, basically asked the Russians to leave. And the Soviets withdrew, they complied. But the Soviet interpretation was that Truman had used the nuclear threat, even though at the time Truman did not make any overt threat. It was simply a demand based on international justice that the Soviet Union should leave Iran. In 1948, you have the Berlin Crisis. The Soviet Union blockades land access routes to West Berlin with military forces, despite the fact that the Soviet Union had no nuclear weapons of its own. The Soviets do eventually back down as American, British, and French resolve continues by flying aircraft into Berlin and feeding the over 1 million people there for several months. In 1950, the Korean War. Mainland China intervenes into the Korean War against the United Nations forces led by the nuclear-armed United States. And they do it because the Soviet Union has had, for the last 12 months, a nuclear capability, which is actually not a very robust nuclear deterrent. In 1953, it's believed that nuclear weapons had some role to play in the termination of the Korean War. The Chinese didn't want to end the war because a large number of Chinese prisoners were original Kuomintang nationalists in China that were sent to fight in Korea, and they wanted to be repatriated to Taiwan and not China. And this was humiliating for the legitimacy of Beijing's communists. So the war dragged on, and then Eisenhower said, well, he might introduce nuclear weapons in order to accelerate a conclusion to this war. And then ultimately a ceasefire was negotiated, and the war ended in 1953. In 1953 and 54, the French Indochina War against the Viet Minh was going very poorly. The Viet Minh, supported by China and the Soviet Union, were inflicting severe losses on the French and limiting their mobility. At the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where the French were being sieged and eventually defeated by the Viet Minh, the French asked the Americans for help, and the Americans had considered using nuclear weapons to save France. Ultimately, the U.S. did not, and the French were defeated, and Vietnam became independent with the other states of Indochina. 1954-55, there was a Taiwan Straits crisis. the nationalist Kuomintang enemies of the communists fled when they lost the Civil War in 1949 to Taiwan. The U.S. Navy protected them on Taiwan. So when the Chinese were shelling the coastal islands that were controlled by Taiwan, the U.S. Navy intervened to stop the Chinese from blockading those islands. And the U.S. was equipped with nuclear weapons, and the Soviets were reluctant to help China. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, the English, French, and Israelis attacked Egypt. The English and French goal was to control the canal. At the same time, the Soviet Union was suppressing a revolt in Hungary. And Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, threatened to use nuclear weapons to protect Egypt against England, France, and Israel. Although it was the threat of an economic nature from the U.S. that ultimately led the French and the English and the Israelis to withdraw. In 1958, you had the collapse of the Hashemite kingdom in Iraq, which was a Western ally, because of Nasserism, which was the support for Arab nationalism that swept throughout the Middle East. It was thought that the Soviet Union would use nuclear weapons to support the revolutions sweeping through the Middle East. And so the U.S. intervened in Lebanon in 1958 to stop what they thought was a coup, and the British landed in Amman, Jordan, to stop a coup there. Essentially, it was thought that the nuclear-armed Soviet Union was providing impetus for social and political change in the Middle East. In 1958, there followed a second Taiwan Straits crisis where China was more aggressive in challenging the Taiwanese over their coastal islands, and they were particularly vocal against the Soviet Union for not supporting them in the attacks on these islands. China wanted the Soviet Union to openly challenge the U.S. and support China's move against Taiwan. This was the key event that led to the Sino-Soviet split in 1959 ideologically, and to the border clash in 1969. In 1961, after 20% of the East German population, mostly the young and educated, had escaped to West Germany, the Soviet Union, with the help of these Germans, built a wall down to the center of Berlin. It was the 1961 Berlin crisis. Because the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, and so did the U.S., it was a standoff, and there was no possibility of intervention. In 1962, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which the Soviet Union attempted to deploy missiles into Cuba so that they could get the U.S. in range. In 1962, the Soviet Union had a few or none operating ICBMs, but they did have bombers, but only 150, that were not likely to make it all the way to the U.S. because of defenses in northern Canada and central Canada. So missiles were put on ships and sent to Cuba secretly, so that the U.S. could be put within range, and so that the U.S. wouldn't invade Cuba and destroy a Soviet ally. Now, the operation was called Operation Anadir, and the Soviets deployed 42 missiles with 36 warheads of the R-12 rocket, and meteor launchers, which are tactical weapons with 80 warheads, and 12 Luna rockets that were also deployed with warheads, and Ilyushin-28 Beagle bombers. There was a blockade, and ultimately, at the end of the crisis, Nikita Khrushchev agreed under humiliating circumstances to withdraw the rockets, which were never operationally ready. They were still in the process of deployment in order to avoid a U.S. bombing and invasion. And Nikita Khrushchev was pushed out of power in the Soviet Union as a consequence of that humiliation. 1969, you have the Sino-Soviet border dispute. Both countries had nuclear weapons. The presence of nuclear weapons, didn't seem to deter the incident of the clash. In 1971, during the Indian invasion of East Pakistan to liberate it and create Bangladesh, they had their aircraft carrier and amphibious forces conducting amphibious landings at Cox's Bazar against Pakistani troops. Richard Nixon, the American president who was sympathetic to Pakistan, sent the Enterprise, a U.S. aircraft carrier armed with nuclear weapons, in 1971 into the Bay of Bengal, where the Indian Navy was. And this caused the Indian Navy to abbreviate their amphibious landing, and their fleet fled to port. Now, while the incident wasn't particularly memorable for the Americans, for India it was fairly traumatic as a nuclear coercion by a superpower. Here you can see the path of the Enterprise as it took its trip through the Bay of Bengal in a form of naval diplomacy. We then have the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. Here, Syria and Egypt invaded Israel in full knowledge that Israel had obtained a nuclear weapon by 1968, although it may have only been a handful. Both states believed that Israel would refrain from the use of nuclear weapons if operations were restricted to the Sinai and the Golan Heights, and Israel's core territories remained free from threat. Notwithstanding, after the failed Israeli counterattacks in the first 40 hours of the war, on October 8, 1973, Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir approved Moshe Dayan's plea to deploy Israel's nuclear arsenal, consisting of single warheads on Jericho-1 missiles. Jericho-1 missiles were missiles obtained from France. When Syrian forces broke through the southern Golan and arrived at the River Jordan, however, they halted their advance, and despite the absence of Israeli blocking forces in that location. So Israel's nuclear weapons didn't deter an attack because Israel and Egypt had calculated that Israel was in no position to be able to use the nuclear weapons. Here you can see the Syrian attack on the Golan and where they got closest to the Jordan River. U.S. and Soviet tensions rose during the crisis as both states rushed to equip their allies. The U.S. set up a chain of aircraft carriers, and airplanes flew of the F-4 variety across the aircraft carriers to Israel. The Soviets also re-equipped their Egyptian and Syrian allies. In that process, the Soviets conducted mock air attacks on U.S. ships, basically approaching them, and this disrupted carrier operations. The Americans increased their DEFCON to signal to the Soviets that they were concerned about the aggressive posture of Soviet forces. Ultimately, nothing happened. The 1980 revolution. The Shah of Iran was forced out of Iran, and the Ayatollah came, and students seized 50-odd American hostages at the American embassy in Tehran, and U.S. could not translate their overwhelming nuclear power to convince Iran to give up their hostages. Ultimately, the hostages were released for other reasons. In 1982, Argentina attacked and seized control of Las Malvinas, the British Falkland Islands. Argentina was not deterred by the fact that the British had nuclear weapons, and the British never thought about using nuclear weapons in this particular conflict. So it shows you that nuclear weapons are circumstantial. It depends whether a threat is sufficient to warrant the use of nuclear weapons, especially when you're a middle power and your reputation is dependent on the alliances with other countries. 1983, the U.S.-Soviet war scare. The Soviet Union went on alerts numerous times in response to what appeared to be deliberate provocations dating between 1979 and 1983. Operation Ryan was a large-scale KGB and GRU espionage operation conducted to uncover a possible U.S. nuclear attack. Number one, the INF, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces decision in 1979, in which the U.S. deployed Pershing IIs, which had very low trajectory and could land in the USSR within 4 to 6 minutes, was thought to be a first strike weapon. On March 23, 1983, Reagan announced SDI, or Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative Missile Defense Program, which was seen as a technological threat to the Soviet Union. The Korean KAL 007 was an airliner that was shot down by a Soviet interceptor, a Flagon S-15 aircraft, over the Kuril Islands, which is one of the ballistic missile submarine sites over the Sea of Okhotsk. And this caused a major uproar. It was thought that the U.S. was using the civilian aircraft as a reconnaissance aircraft to locate Soviet defenses. Number 4, there was a false attack alarm on September 26, 1983. Number 5, NATO conducted the Able Archer nuclear exercise between the November 2nd to 11, 1983, and this was interpreted by the Soviet Union as a preparation for attack. Ultimately, deterrence prevailed. 2 years later, those old Russian geriatric leaders, first Brezhnev and then Chernenko and then Yuri Andropov, they all died and they were replaced by Gorbachev, and the Soviet Union radically changed its perspective. In 1987, India conducted the brass tacks exercise. A large-scale armored exercise in the Ragistan Desert on the Pakistan border, which is normally conducted north-south, was instead conducted in the direction of Pakistan. Both Pakistan and then India in retaliation threatened to use nuclear weapons against each other, although at the time it's not thought either had an operational arsenal. In 1990, India-Pakistan again had a crisis. An insurgency had broken out in Kashmir, and India blamed Pakistan for fueling that insurgency, and had threatened to airstrike suspected militant camps located on the Pakistan side of Kashmir. Pakistan threatened to use nuclear weapons to stop India, and then India threatened to use nuclear weapons against Pakistan. The U.S. intervened diplomatically to try to get these two allies from escalating the conflict. In 1993, there followed a third crisis, again related to nuclear weapons, threats and counter-threats over the infiltration of militants from the Pakistan side of the frontier to the Indian side of Kashmir. So the summary is it the use of nuclear weapons themselves that deters world leaders? Then we can expect to see a use of nuclear weapons in a war when usability becomes feasible. On the other hand, if Robert Jervis is right, and it's the threat of escalation that deters, then nuclear weapons use is very unlikely, and the stability-instability paradox will not make conventional conflict more likely.